speaking. With regard to interpretation for those on Zoom, you have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. For members on Zoom, please use the raised hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can, and we appreciate your patience and understanding. Please also note that during the meeting, it is not permitted to take pictures in the room or screenshots on Zoom. Should any technical challenges arise, please inform us, as we will attempt to correct that very quickly. Now, today we are meeting for clause-by-clause consideration of Bill C-282, an act to amend the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development Act, Supply Management. Welcome to all of the officials that are here at this particular moment. Now, I've had Mr. Virani indicate that he wanted to speak, and Mr. Seaback. All right, so before I introduce the officials, I'll refer to you, Mr. Virani, for a moment.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I just wanted to say thank you for opening up this session, but also that as we have concluded the C-282 hearing of various witnesses over several meetings, I believe it was at least 4 meetings with respect to this bill. I think this is an important piece of legislation, and I'm very keen that we're moving today to clause-by-clause analysis with the goal of returning this bill to the chamber. I noted that unfortunately there appear to be some members of the committee that are continuing to seek motions and put forward motions for prolonging the study of this bill. I don't believe such motions are warranted. I wanted to state very clearly that I and several of my colleagues will be voting against such motions. It is our strong view that this bill has been studied quite thoroughly and quite comprehensively, and that we have enough information before us to ensure to evaluate it appropriately and to make judgment on it therein. It is a short bill. I'm hopeful that we will be able to conclude clause-by-clause analysis today. I'm particularly puzzled by some of the policies of certain members of this committee to try and prolong the study of this bill, given that all parties in the House of Commons voted in favor of this bill, including members of His Majesty's official opposition, and yet we still are being presented with conservative proposals to prolong the study of the bill. To my mind, that seems to work at cross purposes with the voting patterns of the very same members of this committee, and indeed with the directions of their party. And I would view those things as simply obstacles in terms of the passage of this bill that are unwelcome by me and by many of my colleagues, including from many of the other parties. And I would point out that that should not be tolerated, and that we should work diligently to get this back into the chamber, given that all parties, including His Majesty's official opposition, profess to be supporters of supply management. Well, there's an easy way of demonstrating that, and that is by actually proceeding with the passage of this bill and returning it to the House of Commons for further review and for ultimate passage, ideally in that chamber as well. So I'll leave it at that piece, Madam Speaker. Madam Chair, thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Seaback, please.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Despite what my colleague, the Parliamentary Secretary, has said, I do have a motion that I am going to move now, and I am going to move that motion and then speak to that motion. The motion is this, that the Standing Committee on International Trade hold one additional meeting to invite back department officials prior to clause by clause to testify on Bill C-282 regarding urgent concerns raised about the legislation during witness testimony, and that the committee hold no less than 3 additional meetings to ensure that all witnesses can testify in person. So the Parliamentary Secretary has said today that there's no need for further study, and I can't disagree with the Parliamentary Secretary more. And quite frankly, to suggest that we don't support supply management is a somewhat egregious statement. In my riding of Dufferin-Caledon, unlike the riding of Toronto, where he's from, I have many farmers. And I have met with farmers. I meet with farmers all the time, including farmers in the supply managed sector. And so to suggest that we don't support supply management is just disingenuous. So what I would like to talk to start about why this motion is so important and why I think departmental officials should be coming back to this committee. I'm going to talk a little bit about what department officials said about this bill when it came before Parliament as Bill 216, and then contrast that with what they actually said to this committee when this bill came to this Parliament under Bill 282. I think members will be shocked at the inconsistencies that government officials gave with respect to a bill that is, in fact, virtually similar in nature. So one would think that department officials would come and give similar testimony. In fact, they might say the exact same things, because that's what we would expect of government officials, unless, of course, we are dealing with government officials who have been influenced, perhaps, to say something else. So let's go to what was said at the previous meeting. Mr. Forsyth came to speak to Bill 216. And in this bill, he gave a statement. In that statement, he said some of the following. This bill amends the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development Act so that the Government of Canada cannot make any commitments in an international treaty that would have the effect of increasing tariff rate quota volumes or reducing over quota tariff rates for dairy products, poultry and eggs. The intent of this bill is consistent with the long-standing Government of Canada policy to defend the integrity of Canada's supply management system. That is very similar to what we heard when Mr. Forsyth came and spoke. So he then goes on to say, and this is where things start to get a little bit different and a little bit interesting. He goes on to say, I'd like to share with you some considerations regarding this proposed amendment to the Department Act. This is completely different from what government officials said when they came to testify with 282. And it goes on. First, by introducing specific policy objectives, proposed amendments would fundamentally change the nature of the departmental act. The act is an organizational statute that sets out in general terms the powers, duties, and functions of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of International Trade, and the Minister of International Development. It does not prescribe specific policy objectives. This way, the Act sets up a framework that provides flexibility to the government of the day to implement its particular foreign, international trade, and development policy without having to change the underlying legislation. Thus, it accommodates the policy perspectives that different governments may bring to the management of foreign affairs over time. As an example, in terms of international trade negotiations, paragraph 10.2 sub C of the Act provides that the Minister of Foreign Affairs is to conduct and manage international negotiations as they relate to Canada. Section 13 of the Act elaborates on specific duties of the Minister of International Trade, which include improving access of Canadian products and services to external markets through trade negotiations. Second, specific foreign international trade and development policy objectives, including how to address sectoral interests or specific constituent concerns, are generally established elsewhere. That's a very important thing. Second, specific foreign international trade and development policy objectives, including how to address sectoral interests or specific constituent concerns, are generally established elsewhere. This is not what was said when they came to testify on this bill. For international trade negotiations, negotiating objectives and how to accommodate specific sectoral interests are set in the negotiating mandates and are approved by Cabinet. This allows the government of the day to develop specific policy objectives in response to evolving international circumstances. Third, Parliament has the final say over the outcome of any international trade negotiations. Parliament ultimately decides whether or not to pass the legislation necessary to implement any free trade agreement. Additionally, moving forward, trade agreements will be subject to even more parliamentary oversight. The updated policy on tabling of treaties strengthens transparency of trade negotiations and provides additional opportunities for members of Parliament to review the objectives and the economic merits of new free trade agreements. The new policy includes the tabling of a notice of intent to enter into negotiations towards a new FTA, objectives for negotiations, and finally, an economic impact assessment. Fourth, amendment of the Departmental Act in the way in which Bill C-216 proposes carries risks. Now, to me, this is a stunning statement because none of this was said by department officials when they came back for Bill 282. What happened? Why the sudden change? When it was first here, this bill carries risks. Then, when they come back to talk about it this time, suddenly there's no risks. There's no risks in their statement. By limiting Canada's ability to engage on these issues, this amendment, and this is really important, this amendment would invite negotiating partners to narrow the scope of their own potential commitments, taking issues off the table from the outset of negotiations, likely in the areas of commercial interest to Canada. Let me add emphasis to that. Likely in the areas of commercial interest to Canada. The last time officials came to this committee to talk about the bill, they were showing concerns. To me, they're showing grave concerns. Reminds me of that movie, A Few Good Men, when Jack Nicholson, or Nicholas says, are there any other kinds of concerns? Well, these are grave concerns. This narrows possible outcomes, precludes certain compromises, and makes it harder to reach an agreement. This paragraph in of itself is a massive diversion from what government officials came to testify at Committee on 282. And if this were all, I'd be concerned, probably very concerned. But guess what? It's not all they said, because they continued with their concerns. Their entire conversation with this committee was about their concerns. And yet, on 282, there was no discussion of concerns. Absolutely not. They may have had some concerns under questioning, but I'm going to continue. Addressing the interest of any specific sector in the Act would set a precedent that could lead to demands for additional amendments to reflect other foreign and trade policy objectives, including sectoral interests, further constraining the government's ability to negotiate and sign international trade agreements, and more generally to manage Canada's international relations. This is a clarion call of concern by government officials, because what they're actually saying to the committee is, if we do this for one sector of the Canadian economy, how can we then say to another sector that you don't get to have a similar protection? For example, I know the steel industry is facing incredible competition from steel from, for example, China. And this is a huge, huge problem for the steel industry. So they also have extensive competition from the United States. What if the steel industry said, we no longer want any country to be able to have steel come into Canada as part of a free trade agreement because it's far too damaging to our sector? And you did it for supply management, so why won't you do it for steel? And you can imagine where that goes. They go on to say, lastly, maintaining the nature of the Departmental Act unchanged does not affect the government's policy to defend the integrity of Canada's supply management system, nor the ability of negotiators to defend this position at the negotiating table. So they're saying that supply management can be defended, as it always has been, at the negotiating table by the Government of Canada. He seems to be saying that this bill is not necessary. Again, this is very contrasted with the information that was provided by government officials to the committee on 282. The government has made public commitments not to make further concessions on supply managed products in future trade negotiations. In fact, Canada has been able to successfully conclude 15 trade agreements that cover 51 countries while preserving Canada's supply management system, including its 3 pillars: production control, pricing mechanisms, and import controls. Most recently, the Canada-United Kingdom Trade Continuity Agreement fully protects Canada's dairy, poultry, and egg sector and provides no new incremental market access for cheese or any other supply managed product. I am going to get back to the Canada-United Kingdom and the Free Trade Agreement, because that is also something that I think is going to be affected by this and by Bill 282, something that we really haven't discussed in any great detail. Where new market access has been provided, specifically and exclusively in the Canada-European Union Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP, and the United States-Mexico Agreement, CUSMA, the access was deemed necessary to include an agreement that was in Canada's interest. That's similar to the response to a question I had, which was the only reason why, effectively, we were able to make those agreements was because there was some access to supply management. While new access was provided in those agreements, the supply management system and its 3 pillars were maintained. These outcomes were part of the overall balance of concessions through which Canada maintained preferential market access to the United States and secured new access to the European Union, Japan, Vietnam, and other key markets. In conclusion, while the spirit of Bill C-216 is consistent with the government's policy of defending the integrity of Canada's supply management system, amending the Department of Foreign Affairs Trade and Development Act, as proposed by the bill, would change its nature and create risks. Now, that's really quite fascinating, because in conclusion, Mr. Fowler said in our study, and this is really to me, it's shocking. It's shocking that a government official would come and make one statement on the exact same bill and then come and make another statement on this bill. And I think that they should be back at this committee to answer for this contradiction. We should get to the bottom of this, why there is this contradiction. And so the contradiction is this. In his remarks to this committee studying 282, in conclusion, Bill 282 proposes to make the government's commitment to make no further market access commitments for supply management product into a legal requirement by amending the Department of Foreign Affairs Trade and Development Act. This would strengthen the policy of defending the integrity of Canada's supply management system by enshrining it in law. It is the exact opposite of what Mr. Fowler said in his statement on Bill 216. Think about the implications of that for a moment. We have a senior government official comes to the committee with a bill, outlines concerns, outlines serious concerns, and I'm going to talk about more because under questioning, he has even more concerns than in his statement. and then comes back to the committee, gives a statement, and says the exact opposite. And nothing's changed. The bill's the same. Supply management's the same. Nothing has changed. Was this gentleman put under political pressure to change the statement that was made so that it would be less controversial? This is deeply, deeply troubling. Madam Chair, to me, I don't think it matters which party you're from or where you stand on this issue. Every parliamentarian around this table should be saying to themselves, why would a government official come to committee, give one version of concern about a bill, come back another time on effectively the exact same bill and say, there's nothing to see here. This bill's great. It's going to strengthen our defense of supply management. So you might say to yourself, well, maybe he misspoke in 216. Maybe, just got a little excited in his opening statement and misspoke. Well, that unfortunately is not what happened. Because under questioning, there are even more and more and more concerns that are raised that were not raised under Bill 282. Under questioning from Mr. Abutayev, he says, what I'm interested in is this. Although we've signed so many trade agreements without having to really jeopardize the supply management system, we have successfully done that throughout its history. And we have so many trade agreements that I don't have to mention it at the moment. The question is, are there any live examples out there that can advise us on what the consequences will be in the long run if Bill C-216 is implemented? Since we know that we will lose that flexibility and we will be limiting our team of negotiators on the road when they try to achieve trade agreements with countries in the world. I think it'll be very interesting to see what the response to that question was. So let's go to that. Thank you for the question, Madam Chair. I will start, and perhaps my colleagues will join in afterwards. From a trade negotiation perspective, Canada has a long history in negotiating free trade agreements and has been at the forefront of negotiating free trade agreements for the last 25 or 30 years. I would just note off the top that our supply management system, as you've indicated, has not stopped or hampered us from concluding any trade agreements. But I think what is certainly possible is that the wording proposed for this bill will give trade negotiating partners pause with respect to wanting to engage with Canada. Emphasis added. As contrasted with, in conclusion, Bill 282 proposes to make the government's commitment to make no further market access commitments for supply managed products into a legal requirement by amending the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade, and Development Act. This would strengthen the policy of defending the integrity of Canada's supply management system by enshrining it into law. No concerns, but here, this bill will give trade negotiating partners pause with respect to wanting to engage with Canada. From a trade negotiator's perspective, when we start a negotiation, we like to start with the full possibility of access in the back of our minds, whether or not that's where we end up. It's rarely the case that you would see 100% access in any free trade agreement, but you'd like to at least start with that notion in mind. As you go through a negotiation with your various partners, you find that interests are enunciated, elaborated, and narrowed down. You understand what's in the art of the possible, but you like to start as wide as possible when you do launch those negotiations. When you start from a very narrow band of possibilities, and then that gets narrowed the scope of the negotiations and the scope of the agreement is very much smaller than what you would have seen otherwise. If we were to end up with this bill as it is written, I'm going to emphasize this again. If we were to end up with this bill as it is written, I think very much that we would start with a much smaller scope of negotiations with various partners. It wouldn't be unusual for them to say, that's fine, Canada has taken these issues right out of play. We will take issues that are of interest to Canada out of play. Then you're talking about negotiating from a smaller pie, as it were. Madam Chair, these are significant concerns. These are not small concerns that are being raised. This is not someone saying that, let me find it. This bill would strengthen the policy of defending the integrity of Canada's supply management system by enshrining it into law. In fact, to me, this is saying almost the exact opposite. This is saying that this bill is highly, highly, highly problematic. So, then we can look at what else was said about this bill. The current versus what was said before. So, under Bill 282, we had a statement from Mr. Rosser, Assistant Deputy Minister, Market and Industry Services Branch, Department of Agriculture. Honorable members, I appreciate the opportunity to appear before the Standing Committee on International Trade on its review of Bill C-282. Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, AAFC for short, works closely with and supports Global Affairs Canada in advancing Canada's free trade agenda, playing an important role in trade negotiations, particularly in areas related to market access for agricultural goods. As said by my counterpart, Mr. Fowler, the Government of Canada has a long-standing policy to defend the integrity of Canada's supply management system for dairy products, poultry, and eggs. This includes clear commitments made by the Prime Minister and the Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food not to provide any new market access for supply managed products in future trade agreements. The bill is consistent with this policy. And that is something that I don't think anyone has disputed. We're all singing from the same hymn book in that context. Canada's supply managed dairy, poultry, and egg farmers are part of the backbone of rural communities across the country, generating almost $13 billion in farm gate sales in 2021 and creating over 100,000 direct jobs in production and processing activities across Canada. I absolutely agree with that statement. In my riding of Dufferin-Caledon, we have both poultry, eggs, and dairy farms. I've had the pleasure to visit almost examples of all of those. Particularly impressed with how our dairy farmers both take care of their cows and the quality product that they're able to produce. I am 100% in support of supply management. And we continue. With respect to the market access provided to Canada's trade partners, it has only been provided in exceptional cases in regard to landmark trade agreements, such as the agreement establishing the World Trade Organization, or WTO, CETA, the CPTPP, and CUSMA. While not taken lightly, these trade agreements are overwhelmingly in the interest of Canada and to the overall benefit of Canada's agricultural sector. Furthermore, in the case of CUSMA, it's important to remember that the original negotiating position in the United States was the full elimination of the supply management system The outcome in CUSMA, while difficult and challenging, allows the supply management system to continue functioning with respect to its three pillars. The Government of Canada is also fully and fairly compensating producers with supply managed commodities who've lost market share under the three agreements. As announced this past November, dairy, poultry, and egg producers and processors are expected to share more than $1.7 billion in direct payments and investment programs in response to the impacts related to CUSMA. This is in addition to the over $3 billion in direct payments in investment programs for CETA and CPTPP. These programs will help drive innovation and growth in the supply managed sectors. In conclusion, the integrity of the supply management system has been successfully defended during multiple trade negotiations. The Government of Canada is working hard to ensure that the supply management system remains strong and that producers and processors operating in the system remain productive and sustainable. Bill C-282 would protect these sectors from additional market access concessions in the context of future trade negotiations, and as such is fully consistent with existing policy. So under 282, it would appear they're on the same page, right? Nothing to see here. It's great. It's fully consistent with existing policy. So let's go back to 216. Mr. Aaron Fowler, Chief Agricultural Negotiator and Director General Trade Agreements and Negotiations, Department of Agriculture and Agri-Food, responding to Mr. Aboutieff's question. And just so we all can keep up with where we are, Mr. Aboutieff's question was, what I'm interested in is this. Although we've signed so many trade agreements, without having to really jeopardize the supply management system, we have successfully done that throughout its history, and we have so many trade agreements that I don't have to mention it at the moment. The question is, are there any live examples out there that can advise us on what the consequences will be in the long run if Bill C-216 is implemented? Since we know that we will lose that flexibility, we will be limiting our team of negotiators on the road when they try to achieve trade agreements with countries in the world. And the response is, thank you very much, Chair. I would certainly agree with everything Doug has said so far and associate myself with his response. And that response, as we all know, is there are grave concerns about this bill and the implications that it will have with respect to negotiating trade agreements. I believe that the question was whether there are examples of similar measures being imposed by some of our trading partners around the world and what consequences of those might be. I'd have to say I am not aware of any legislative provision in our trading partners' ability to discuss an issue. And this is interesting because some members of this committee, when they were asking questions, they were saying, but other countries have things that they won't negotiate. And to me, it would appear that that's an incorrect position. I don't think that there is any other country in the world that has a legislative prohibition on what you can negotiate in an international trade agreement. So the statement continues. Were such a prohibition in place, I feel that depending on the level of commercial interest that Canada had in the matter that was covered by such a prohibition, we would use the exploratory stage of our trade negotiations to indicate that we see this as an important issue that needs to be discussed in the context of the negotiation. Free trade agreements are really about changing the legislative and regulatory regime that our trading partners have in place in order to create commercial opportunities for Canadian exporters. So I suspect that were our interest sufficiently significant for us to want to discuss that issue in negotiations, we would make that very clear at the exploratory stage and base our decision on whether to move forward in the negotiations, on our partners' indication of their capacity to have discussions in that area. On the specific question of whether there are examples I could point to, I have to say offhand, I can't think of any similar prohibitions that are in place. Mr. Abutieff then asked another question. What would you see as the reaction of other sectors if something like Bill 216 went forward? What would you see as the reaction as far as opportunities on the world stage go? Mr. Forsyth said, do you mean reaction from Canadian stakeholders? Yes, I mean Canadian stakeholders. Mr. Forsyth, honestly, I think if this did go forward, the reaction we would see would be other groups seeking to have their concerns, their issues inserted into the Department Act as well. So what we're hearing very clearly here under 216, and perhaps not as clearly under 282, is that this bill is in many ways a Trojan horse. There are grave concerns about what would happen with other sectors of the economy that felt like they were vulnerable in a trade agreement. And they might be saying, well, I think a member of parliament should come forward with a bill, and that bill should say that in no future trade agreement should the pork industry be no access to pork into the Canadian market because we feel like we're losing too much market share. And that is a concern that's being raised by department officials when we heard this in 216. It's not a concern that has been significantly raised this time. There was another question for Mr. Forsyth, and this was by Ms. Rachel Bendan. Sir, if I may follow up, I believe you mentioned in your introduction, and I have certainly heard from legal experts within the government, that policy objectives are not normally found within the within the Departmental Act. This is not the usual instrument to include policy objectives like the one regarding supply management. Can you perhaps give us examples or let us know where these types of important policy objectives should be found, if not in this particular act? Mr. Forsyth, I think that assessment is correct. It would be unusual to find policy prescriptive issues like this in a departmental act. I'm not aware of any departmental acts that include them. I think that where we see policy prescriptions like this is in the words enunciated from the government. It is very clear that this is a Government of Canada position, a policy position. You find it in speeches. You find it in departmental legislation, for example, at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and you find it in various places like that. I think it would be unusual to put something like this within the context of a departmental act. But what we're seeing here from government officials, again, is this. We are seeing that, in conclusion, Bill 282 would protect these sectors from additional market access concessions in the context of future trade negotiations, and as such is fully consistent with existing policy. And I read through that entire statement that was made by Mr. Rosser. None of that raises even a scintilla of the concern that is being raised by government officials under 216. And I'm yet again left with some significant consternation as to why there would be such a different view from government departments from a bill, Bill 216, which is, as far as I can tell, identical to the bill that is being put forward now. So it raises enormous questions. It raises questions that I believe this committee should dig into. It raises questions that we should absolutely, as a committee, be very interested in getting to the bottom of. And for my colleague, the parliamentary secretary, to suggest that everything has been heard that needs to be heard, that we should just move on to clause by clause, I think in the face of this, to me, very contradictory evidence from department officials really does not make a lot of sense. It gives me enormous concern. Gives me enormous concern about why there'd be such a change in position and view about the bill. And not just that it's changed. It gives me the concern that which statements are the ones that the committee should look at and say, this is actually what the department officials think. Is it that the department officials think that what they said on 216 is what they think? Or is it what they said when they came and spoke on 282? I'm left confused. I'm left extraordinarily confused. I think other members of the committee should be confused as well. I think Liberal members of this committee should be confused. I think NDP members of this committee should be confused. I understand that Bloc Québécois members may be confused but aren't interested because it's a Bloc Québécois private members bill and they want it to be passed. I would feel the same way about one of my colleagues' bills, that I would want to help that colleague get the bill passed. But I think the rest of us should be very, very, very concerned. So Mr. Dhaliwal then had a question under 216. My question is for Mr. Forsyth. He mentioned numerous times that there are some risks involved. And that's talking about his statement numerous times that there are risks involved. There was no mention of risks in the opening statement in under 282. So my question is for Mr. Forsyth. He mentioned numerous times that there are some risks involved. One of them he mentioned is a narrow outcome. I would like to ask him to explain or elaborate on those risks and the potential impacts. Now that's interesting that he asked a question about narrow outcomes, because when we had witnesses come last Thursday, canola, the canola growers or the Canadian canola, where was it? The Canadian, I'm going to find it here.
Madam Chair, could I just raise a point of order, please?
The Canadian, where was it? Let me find it.
Hold on, Mr. Seaback. Yes,
Canola Council of
Mr.
Canada.
Seaback, can just hold on one second. Can Mr. Vareni raise a point of order? Yes. What's your point of
So,
order? please?
Madam Chair, on a point of order, it's sort of 2 points. One is that I believe Mr. Seaback is raising matters that relate to a bill that was studied in the previous Parliament and not germane to this particular bill. So I just raised that for you in terms of relevance. But also just I appreciate he's entitled to speak for as long as he may like on his motion, but we've got 5 officials who are sitting here, and out of courtesy to them, if you could perhaps indicate how long he might take, that might alleviate the time for these officials to get on with other pressing matters of government business that they otherwise might want to attend to. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Jennings.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to address the point of order raised by my colleague across the way and just say, first off, I'm grateful for the opportunity to sub at the Trade Committee. I don't think I've been here yet this Parliament, and I know that our trading relationships with countries around the world are extremely important. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to be a guest here today, and I work with Mr. Varani on the Canada-Tibet Friendship Group, so it's a bit of a different format, but it's always good to be able to work with him. Just on the particulars of the point of order, Madam Chair, that he raised. First of all, I do think it's important to just underline that there are no limitations in terms of whether you can refer to things happen in the previous Parliament. the rules on what you can and can't refer to are fairly broad. Members may reference important precedents that come from previous parliaments that involve other countries, and use that information in order to help them inform and understand best kind of what they're working on and what applies to the particulars of the case before the committee. So I don't think that the fact that it draws on a precedent from a previous parliament that alone could in any way be seen as providing a basis for making a determination with respect to the relevance of the issue being raised. I think it's quite germane to look at that if the text of the same bill was proposed as a bill in a previous parliament, and if advice was received from officials in the context of that previous parliament, it would seem most important. Certainly on the various committees I've been a part of, that has been a standard procedure to try to refer to precedents on similar bills from other parliaments previously, other bills that may raise similar kinds of issues. So I think the points that were made were certainly valid, and I think they're important. And I think I think the arguments that are being made are important, but maybe they underline just the need for that education to be shared with members across the way who may not fully appreciate or understand the relevance and significance of the issues that are being put forward. And then in terms of the other point raised, I don't think respectfully that is a matter of order, that questions of what content should or shouldn't be in the speech or who should be told what. These are not matters that would typically be thought of as being matters of order. Matters of order are those that are prescribed by the standing orders, and my colleague across the way is quite right to say, and I'll just refer to the standing orders here in terms of the rights of members as it relates to speaking on issues. I can think of Standing Order 116, for example, 2A, that says unless a time limit has been adopted by the committee or by the House, the chair of a standing special or legislative committee may not bring a debate to an end while there are members present who still wish to participate. A decision of the chair in this regard may not be subject to an appeal to the committee. And 116.2b goes on to read that a violation of paragraph A of this section may be brought to the attention of the Speaker by any member, and the Speaker shall have the power to rule on the matter. If, in the opinion of the Speaker, such violation has occurred, the Speaker may order that all subsequent proceedings in relation to the said violation be nullified. So those are the standing orders. I think, in fact, that's a relatively recent addition to the standing orders that was agreed by the House, but it certainly was designed to protect the rights of members when it comes to these issues. And, of course, members don't always know exactly the specific nature of the points that they want to make, and there's no obligation to have pre-timed or pre-written remarks in advance. So I think, with all due respect, Mr. Virani, the interventions are, they're germane and they're in order, and certainly the standing orders that I have read and others do provide important protections with respect to what a member can do. I don't have the standing order in front of me precisely, but there are clear other standing orders that do provide for those rights. So I'll leave the points there, but I just wanted to provide that clarification and clarity in response to the points raised by my colleague and friend, Mr. Virani.
Thank you for clarifying that. Mr. Seebeck, I'm going back to you.
Yes.
But before I do that, I stopped in the middle of introducing the officials that are here for this clause by clause today. And we have from Department of Agriculture and Agri-Food, we have Tom Rosser, Assistant Deputy Minister, Market and Industry Services Branch. And from the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development, we have Aaron Fowler, Associate Assistant Deputy Minister, Trade Policy and Negotiations. Stacey Paul Healy, Deputy Director, Tariffs and Market Access Law Division. Pierre Marrier, Executive Director, Tariffs and Goods Market Access, and from Anna Capellas, Director, Treaty Law Division. Thank you for joining us today. Given the fact that the officials are here to do clause by clause on 282, I have a long speaking list here, which tells me that we're not going to get to clause by clause. Is it the will of the committee to allow our officials to go, and when we're at a point where we're ready to get on with clause by clause, we will invite you back? Is that okay with the committee if we allow the officials to leave?
Madam Speaker, if they could just make sure that if we could facilitate their virtual participation as early as today, then we would have no objection to that. So, no,
Would it be possible for you to go back to your offices and connect to virtual in case we end up with an opportunity for us to move forward?
in a fit of optimism, I would like that option to be available.
I suspect the will of the committee will be to hear from additional witnesses, Mr. Brown.
It becomes very difficult because they've got to do the technical tests with our translators and all the rest of it. It's almost 4:30 now. There's another hour. On my list, I have Mr. Genius, Mr. Baldinelli, Mr. Varani, Mr. Carey, and Mr. Aria on my speaking list at the moment. So that's where we are. So if the committee's in agreement, the witnesses, I will thank you very much. Apologies that we're not able to move forward, but we don't want to consume too much more of your valuable time. Mr. Varani.
Well, just on this very point, I mean, I'm very keen on being courteous with the time of the 5 officials, some of whom have actually been quoted in the context of the last 45 minutes, which I thought is interesting. Hope the quotes are accurate, Mr. Rosser. But I also just think it's important for Canadians who are watching that what we're having here is blatant obstruction from a party that is ostensibly in defense of supply management, preventing us from actually getting
This
forward
seems like a
with
point
a
of
bill
debate,
that
not a
relates to
point of
supply
Let's not get
management.
into a
So
debate. Okay.
just want that clear for
We'll have a
Canadians who are
chance to
watching.
speak, I think,
Mr.
when it gets to it.
Mr. Seaback has the floor. Is it all, I'm getting, it's okay with the committee members if our witnesses wish to leave, they are able to leave.
Well, I'd invite my Bloc and NDP colleagues to opine on this issue.
Okay, Mrs. Sever Tremblay, is it all right if the witnesses leave today? Because we're not going to get into clause by clause by the looks of it.
Écoutez, oui, mais si on peut
Look, yes, but if we also want to make sure that our colleagues, and honestly, our genuine apologies, we are usually more elegant in our behaviors than you see today. And I'd also like to shout out to the agricultural producers who are tuning in and who are looking to the future. You know what to do next.
Cannings?
Well, if it's clear from our Conservative colleagues that they have no intention of getting to clause by clause today, I would be very happy to invite the
Okay, to our
witnesses to leave. And
Thank you very much
leave
for
this to
being
us.
here, and my apologies. All right, back to Mr. Seaback.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I always find it very interesting and curious when members from the Liberal Party say when we're trying to do due diligence, debate, or look into issues, that it's obstruction and that we're against things. Nothing can be further from the truth. I will be visiting farms in my riding over the break, in particular with dairy farmers who I know work so hard. I doubt that the parliamentary secretary will be visiting dairy farmers in his riding over the break. So to go back to where I was, this was Mr. Dhaliwal's question, and he said, my question is for Mr. Forsyth. He mentioned numerous times that there are some risks involved. One of them, he mentioned, is a narrow outcome. I would like to ask him to explain or elaborate on those risks and the potential impacts. Mr. Forsyth, I'd be happy to elaborate on some of those risks and what would happen in a trade negotiation if one were to be negotiating with not the full basket of items on the table. I highlighted it in one of my earlier answers, but I'm happy to flag it again. I think that as a trade negotiator, you'd like to start the negotiation with as many items on the table as possible and allows, as many items on the table as possible. It does potentially allow for trade-offs and allows for a broad discussion with your trading partner in order to understand what is within the art of the possible. It is incumbent on us as trade negotiators to make sure that our trading partners understand our key defensive interests and what our red lines are and what things we cannot do. As I've said, throughout my negotiating career, it's been clear that concessions made in the supply management sector are red lines. That is what was in my mandate for the Canada-UK TCA, and that was what was respected. If we were to start from the position that we would not be dealing with 100% of the items that we would negotiate on, it does risk having an agreement that's not necessarily completely beneficial to Canadian exporters and producers. And it does risk being an agreement that does not necessarily provide the full economic benefit to Canada that one might have expected. This is, to me, just an absolutely incredible paragraph. It sets out how deeply concerned Mr. Fowler was with respect to Bill 216, which is now effectively the exact same as Bill 282. And yet, we did not get 10% of that concern when we were, hearing from government officials when we're talking about 282. So the answer continues. We have not faced that yet to date, but it is possible that if we were to go down the path provided in Bill C-216, that is in fact what we would do. It would be quite likely that our trading partners would take off the table something of interest to Canadian exporters and producers. And then we would be faced with the situation of negotiating an agreement that might not be as beneficial to Canada as it could be. And so here we are today talking about what's been studied with respect to Bill 282. What we've talked about is we need additional meetings. Why do we need additional meetings? Well, for one thing, we did not get evidence like this during the study of 282. We got nothing like this from government officials. And so what is something that we proposed? We proposed that we should have some trade experts come to the committee to talk about this. And that's what we're asking for. And we've been asking for this for quite some time. Madam Chair, if you recall, I had a similar motion with respect to this. The motion was adjourned. The committee meeting was adjourned, and the committee did not recognize the need to have additional meetings as a result of that adjournment. But nothing, quite frankly, could be further from the truth because, and this is the really critical part about that statement, we would be faced with the situation of negotiating an agreement that might not be as beneficial to Canada as it could be. That's the effect of our government officials with respect to Bill 216, which is identical to Bill 282. And yet, we're moving through here on 282 without seemingly any consideration for this, any desire to have a more in-depth conversation from perhaps trade experts. We certainly have Mr. Verhoeven on our list of witnesses. He would be an expert, someone who could give us very clear guidance on how serious an impact this would have on our negotiating positions. So I want to say, maybe I'll turn to my colleague from Agriculture Canada to see if he'd like to add anything. So Mr. Fowler then goes on to say, thank you very much. No, I fully agree. So he fully agrees. We can ask, what does he fully agree with? Well, I would say that he fully agrees that if we were to go down the path provided in Bill 216, that is in fact what we would do. It is quite likely our trading partners would take off the table something of interest to Canada. We'd be faced with the situation of negotiating an agreement that might not be as beneficial to Canada as it could be. Under Bill 216, we have very clear agreement from government officials about the significant consequences that this bill could have, well, actually, I think what they think the consequences of the bill would have if it were passed. And we get just a modicum of that concern when they came back to talk about Bill 282. And again, this gives me grave concerns about what we should actually believe. And quite frankly, the only way to get an answer to that is if we have these gentlemen come back to committee and give them pointed questions with respect to the evidence they gave under 216 and the evidence they gave under 282, and have them answer those questions. That's the only way we get to the bottom of this inconsistency. So the rest of Mr. Fowler's answer. No, I fully agree. Trade negotiation has reached what we call a balance of commitments or balance of concessions or commensurate level of ambition with your trading partner. That's an important phrase, level of ambition with your trading partner. To the extent that there are issues that are of interest that we're not in a position to discuss, the reasonable conclusion would be that the overall level of ambition of the agreement would necessarily be diminished as a result of that position. So they're very clearly stating that not only is it going to be challenging from a negotiating perspective, they are saying that the level of ambition of the agreement would be diminished, which I think is interesting because when we had, I'm going to just try and find it now, we had Mr. Troy Sherman come to talk about this at our committee. And Mr. Sherman is from the Canola Council of Canada. And this is what he had to say. My name is Troy Sherman. I'm the Director, Government Relations with the Canola Council of Canada. The council encompasses all links in the canola value chain. Our members include canola growers, life science companies, grain handlers, exporters, processors, and others. Our shared goal is to ensure the industry's continued growth and success, and to do this by meeting global demand for canola and canola-based products, which include food, feed, and fuel. Canola's success is Canada's success. Our industry represents almost $30 billion in economic activity annually, 207,000 jobs across the country, $12 billion in wages, and the largest share of farm cash receipts in the country. With over 90% of Canadian canola exported to as many as 50 different markets, the canola industry depends on an ambitious, fair, science and rules-based trade. For many years, we have worked with Canada's trade negotiators to make sure that Canada and Canadian canola is well positioned to help feed the world. Central to these trade negotiations is the foundational principle that negotiators should be empowered to reach the best agreement for Canadians and the Canadian economy. Negotiators have been able to achieve this by availing themselves of all the tools in our trade negotiating toolbox, working closely with industry, academics, and civil society to ensure that Canada's trade agreements achieve what's in our national interests. And so this is what is being said to achieve the national interests. We go back to what Mr. Forsyth said, and that is that, and it does risk being an agreement that does not necessarily provide the full economic benefit to Canada that one might have expected. Mr. Sherman goes on to say, Bill 282 risks undermining Canada's reputation as a trading nation and consequently undermining our national interests in trade negotiations. Bill 282 does this in a number of ways, including putting in place legislative prohibitions on what our negotiators are able to discuss at the negotiating table and diminishing Canada's desirability as a market with which to pursue trade agreements. So when you talk about the level of ambition, Mr. Sherman is saying the exact same thing, diminishing Canada's desirability as a market with which to pursue trade agreements. On the first point, Bill C-282 is proposing to prohibit what Canada's trade negotiators can discuss at the negotiation table. To the best of our knowledge, and as noted by officials at Global Affairs Canada, no other country legislatively prohibits negotiators from discussing certain topics during trade negotiations. Canada would be an outlier, and needlessly so. In March of 2021, an official of Global Affairs appeared before this very committee on Bill C-216, the predecessor to Bill C-282. And at that time, they stated the following: Canada has been able to successfully conclude 15 trade agreements that covers 51 countries while preserving Canada's supply management system. So Mr. Sherman was also aware of the evidence that Government of Canada officials were giving under Bill 216. The officials went on to say, if we were to start from the position that we would not be dealing with 100% of the items that we would negotiate on, it does risk having an agreement that's not necessarily completely beneficial to Canadian exporters and producers, and it does risk being an agreement that does not necessarily provide the full economic benefit to Canada one might have expected. He says, what was true when that was said 2 years ago remains true today. Bill C-282 is a solution in search of a problem and risks undermining other industries and sectors of the economy, including Canadian canola. Passing Bill C-282 will set a dangerous precedent for additional amendments to the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade, and Development Act in order to either protect certain industries or mandate restrictive language in trade agreements in specific areas of interest. Regarding the second challenge mentioned, Bill C-282 will significantly diminish Canada's desirability as a country with which to pursue trade negotiations. And let's go back. Canola represents $30 billion in economic activity to this country annually, 207,000 jobs across the country. Think about that for a second. 207,000 jobs and $12 billion in wages. $12 billion in wages. And they are deeply, deeply, deeply concerned with this bill. Sorry, and I've lost my spot here, but by legislating that our negotiators are not able to include supply management as part of the negotiations, Canada is significantly shrinking the trade prospect pie and potentially forcing Canadian concessions in other areas of interest. If Canada is viewed as an obstacle for new entrants to plurilateral agreements or less attractive to engage with, given our legislated red line on supply management, our trading partners may question the value of having Canada at the negotiating table. To conclude, Bill C-282 represents a significant departure from Canada's principled, fair, and rules-based trade posture. No industry, sector, or issue should be off the table during trade negotiations. Our trade negotiators have delivered tangible results and benefits for the Canadian economy and industries, including canola. So Mr. Sherman is right on point with what Mr. Fowler said with respect to Bill 216, that the reasonable conclusion would be that the overall level of ambition of the agreement would be diminished as a result of that position being that we take certain Canadian sector of the Canadian economy off of the trade agenda. So Mr. Dhaliwal then asked, and this I think is quite interesting, because this also never came out in the discussion from government officials with respect to 282. He says, Madam Chair, it's also mentioned that in introducing specific policy objectives, that the proposed amendments wouldn't fundamentally change the Madam Chair, it is also mentioned that in introducing specific policy objectives, the proposed amendments wouldn't fundamentally change the nature of the departmental act. I would like to hear an elaboration on that particular issue as well. Mr. Forsyth. Thank you, Madam Chair. If you look at the act itself, it really does set out. It is an organizational statute that sets out in general terms what the powers and duties and functions are for ministers. It does not have any specific policies related to what the Minister of International Trade, the Minister of International Development, or the Minister of Foreign Affairs ought to be doing. It doesn't elaborate on any government policies of the day. It's a general act that sets out the terms and conditions, if you will, for the department and the ministers and the deputy ministers. It's not policy. And this is the danger with putting something like this within that act. You are actually putting policy into the act. What happens if others decide that we should be putting policy into not just trade in the act, perhaps putting in foreign policy into the act, or international development policy into the act? It sets a terrible, terrible precedent, something that we should absolutely have departmental officials back to talk about, especially considering the fact that their testimony seems so starkly different from one committee appearance to the other. Mr. Lobb then had a question. The first question I have is for Mr. Forsyth. Dan, thank you for appearing before committee. I think you've been in the lead for most appearances since I've been on the committee, maybe you and the minister, so congratulations on being available. When we say that we can't ever say we're not going to put certain items forward at the beginning of a trade negotiation, I understand the sentiment, but I'm curious. When we were doing the USMCA deal, softwood lumber never made its way on there, and Buy America really never got resolved either. How does that happen? Mr. Fowler says, I wasn't directly involved with the broader Canada-US-Mexico negotiation at the time, but my understanding is that we certainly did start with the broadest possible negotiating objectives, including trying to deal with softwood lumber in some way, shape, or form, as well as trying to deal with trying to negotiate a government procurement chapter in relation to the Buy America provisions. It was clear as we started to narrow down the issues that the United States would not engage on either of those issues, so they were put aside. Well, imagine if in 6 years, as we heard from the committee, that we can look at the CUSMA agreement. And if this piece of legislation is in place, what would the effect of that be with respect to that renegotiation? I think that's something that we have to get some expert advice on. The other issue is this. It's interesting that that softwood lumber was trying to be discussed in the renegotiation of CUSMA. Right now, the Minister of International Trade is trying to resolve the softwood lumber dispute. And it would be interesting to see what the effect of Bill 282 would have on her ability to negotiate softwood lumber. We know that the United States right now has complaints with respect to how the TRQs are allocated within CUSMA with respect to dairy. Would this bill be an aggravating circumstance in trying to negotiate the resolution of the softwood lumber dispute, a dispute that's collected $8 billion, over $8 billion in duties now? Based on the last softwood lumber settlement, Canada would be entitled to $6 billion of those duties being returned. You can only imagine what the Canadian softwood lumber industry could do with $6 billion in improvements in machinery and equipment, the ability to perhaps export more to the United States. Again, very serious questions with respect to the implications of this bill, and therefore, this is something that we absolutely need to have more meetings to discuss, because we, quite frankly, do not have any of the answers to that. So if we go back to what we heard from department officials, Mr. Aria was asking Mr. Fowler, Mr. Fowler, you indicated rightly that without this bill, Canada has been able to limit access to protect the supply management that we have today. Why do we need this bill at all? I am quite certain I am not the person to ask that question of, Madam Chair, which is interesting because under 216, they were seeming to suggest that Bill 216 is not necessary at all. And Bill 216 is the exact same bill as 282. So we have to ask ourselves why, when they came to committee the first time, they suggested that the bill was not really necessary. And on this time, when they come back and they're asked a direct question, do you think the bill is necessary? They decide not to answer. It's a bit of a head scratcher, isn't it? The first time, we don't think this bill's necessary. This time, I don't think I'm the right person to answer this question. That really gives me pause. That says to me something's happened. That a witness who answered a question one time now won't answer a question another time. It's this is a very head-scratching situation. So Mr. Aria tries again. Okay, I'll ask this one. If this bill is passed, you're going to say that it will not affect you in any way. Is there no constraint on you at all in negotiating any new agreement? I think it would be disingenuous for me to suggest that a piece of legislation that's before the Canadian Parliament would have no impact. I believe the intent of the bill is to have an impact. My conclusion is that it will have an impact. I can't speculate precisely on what that impact will be because I don't know who we'll be negotiating with in the future or what their interests would be in the context of those negotiations. Now, that is a very interesting way to say I can't speculate on what the impact would be. So it's interesting because at the last committee hearing, Mr. Forsyth said, if we were to end up with this bill as it is written, I think very much that we would start with a much smaller scope of negotiations with various partners. It wouldn't be unusual for them to say, that's fine. Canada has taken these issues right out of play. We will take issues that are of interest to Canada out of play. Then you're talking about negotiating from a smaller pie, as it were. Here on 282, I can't speculate on what the impact would be. Well, it would seem to me that when Bill 216 was being studied at committee, our department officials had a very good idea of what the impact would be. And somehow, some strange way, they suddenly didn't think they could anticipate what the impact would be. This is another example of why we need additional meetings. This is another example of why department and government officials need to come back to this committee and explain exactly what's changed. Why has their views changed? Why are they saying that different things? And I'm going to go on to this a little more because Mr. Arya was quite persistent in his questions. I suspect he perhaps saw some of the previous evidence that was given by department officials and was trying to get some answers. Mr. Arya says, you're stating that your hands would have been tied, sort of, if this bill had been there. Coming back to CUSMA, the next president of the United States might seek to renegotiate, tank this, and seek to renegotiate. If this bill passes, what will Canada's position be in those negotiations? Well, I would think that Mr. Fowler would say, based on the what was said by the Government of Canada under 216, this would be difficult. This is going to tie our hands. This is going to narrow the scope of our ability to negotiate. But unfortunately, that's not what he says. He says, I believe, Madam Chair, that the position would by necessity be consistent with what is set out in the piece of legislation that is before the committee. That is to say that Canadian negotiators could advance no additional market access in those sectors, nor could the government of the day accept to make such concessions. This is extremely less forthcoming in answering a question than what we saw when 216 was here at this committee. And again, it is an identical bill. Mr. Arya is a determined man. He wasn't prepared to let that go. So he asked another question. My concern is that it will affect negotiating an overall trade agreement with the United States and Mexico with terms like the current one, which are favorable to Canada. Finally, Mr. Fowler admits it would have an impact on those negotiations, I think. Would it be a negative impact? Given the United States' interest in the dairy sector, in particular in Canada, I think an inability to discuss those issues would make it more difficult to reach a conclusion. So again, very hedgy, this answer. Very hedgy. Not the very clear declarations that Mr. Fowler was giving in the previous parliament, in the previous study of this bill. And so I find it, again, enormously challenging for us as parliamentarians to be at this committee and say, let's rush to clause by clause. Let's just get it done. We have completely inconsistent statements from our government officials as to what the effect would be. We know that, for example, just in the canola sector, right? Just in the canola sector, that Mr. Sherman, $30 billion in economic activity, $12 billion in wages, and the largest share of farm cash receipts in the country. They are extraordinarily concerned about this bill. They believe that it is going to have an extremely detrimental impact on future trade negotiations, a detrimental impact on their ability to export products, and they are a major exporter. And they provide $12 billion in wages to Canadian families from coast to coast to coast. We know how difficult it is to make ends meet right now. I suspect if you don't have a job, it's going to be much, much more difficult than that. So Mr. Arya then says there will be a negative impact. The Canadian Agri-Food Trade Alliance, which represents 90% of Canadian farmers, producers, food manufacturers, and agri-food business that depends on trade, says it strongly opposes Bill C-282. It stated, this legislation creates a dangerous precedent and diminishes Canada as a free trade partner. Do you agree with this statement? And this, again, is where it gets interesting. Because the answer that we get here is very different from the answer that we got. So I'm going to start with the answer to Mr. Aria's question, which is, I'm familiar with the statement, the views of the Canadian Agri-Food Trade Alliance and its concerns. I've discussed these issues with the trade alliance in the past. I think it's the job of Canadian negotiators to ensure that we operate to the maximum advantage of Canadian industry stakeholders, irrespective of the mandate and the operating environment in which we work. We will continue to do that. So the statement is talking about how it's a dangerous precedent. Mr. Aria is asking Mr. Fowler, do you agree with this? And Mr. Fowler, once again, is very, very careful with his answer. I mean, so careful that he almost doesn't say anything. But if we go back to 216, Mr. Forsyth was asked this question. And Mr. Forsyth says, I'd be happy to elaborate on some of the risks that would happen in a trade negotiation if one were to be negotiating with not the full basket of items on the table. I highlighted it in one of my earlier answers, but I'm happy to flag it again. So Mr. Forsyth is very clear and forthcoming under questioning as to the impact of Bill C-216. Very clear. And all the department officials who came were very clear on 216. Mr. Forsyth was very clear in the answers, and Mr. Fowler was also very clear in answers. To go back to Mr. Fowler, we have not faced that fact to date. So I'm going to back up. If we were to start from the position that we would not be dealing with 100% of the items that we would negotiate on, it does risk having an agreement that's not necessarily completely beneficial to Canadian exporters and producers. And it does risk being an agreement that does not necessarily provide the full economic benefits to Canada that one might have expected. We have not faced that to date, but it is possible that if we were to go down the path provided in Bill C-216, that it is in fact what we would do. It would be quite likely that our trading partners would take off the table something of interest to Canadian exporters and producers, and then we would be faced with a situation of negotiating an agreement that might not be as beneficial to Canada as it could be. Okay, so then he turns it over to my colleague for Agriculture Canada, Mr. Fowler. Thank you very much. No, I fully agree. Let's go back to Mr. Aria's question. The Canadian Agri-Food Trade Alliance, which represents 90% of Canadian farmers, producers, food manufacturers, and agri-food businesses that depend on trade, say it's strongly opposed to 282. It stated this legislation creates a dangerous precedent and diminishes Canada as a free trade partner. Do you agree with this statement? The very similar question was asked under 216. I just gave you part of that answer, where Mr. Fowler is saying he agrees that this would have a serious, it would diminish Canada as a free trade partner. But somehow, under 282, this is the answer we get. I'm familiar with the statement. Okay, great. I've discussed these issues with the Alliance. I think it is the job of Canadian negotiators to ensure that we operate to the maximum advantage of industry stakeholders, irrespective of the mandate and operating environment in which we work. We will continue to do that. It's a completely different answer. It's almost a complete evasion of the question. And we as a committee, we're just supposed to say, well, nothing to see here because what they said under 282 That's all that we should be concerned about. When they said something almost diametrically opposed last time, well, as parliamentarians, we should just move on. We're busy. Let's not have an extra meeting or two to try and get to the bottom of it, right? I mean, it's only $12 billion at risk of salaries to Canadian workers. But let's move on, right? Nothing to see here. These are, to me, incredibly, incredibly, incredibly concerning issues. The government officials say, well, they understand the concerns, sort of that's it, but we're not going to acknowledge them. That's where we are under 282. Under 216, it is very, very, very different. And I find that, Madam Chair, to be deeply and extraordinarily challenging. Something that I am very, very unhappy with. And something, quite frankly, it wouldn't be too hard. It really wouldn't be too hard for this committee to get to the bottom of it. We need a few extra meetings. My motion talks about one additional meeting to invite departmental officials back prior to clause by clause. Not only because we heard such fearful testimony from other aspects of the Canadian economy, but also I think perhaps department officials would like to clear up how their statements seem to be, wildly inconsistent. That's my perspective. I was a litigation lawyer for, over a decade. And when you see statements that are wildly inconsistent, you think that you have to get to the bottom of it. Because if you don't actually know where the truth lies. So I think that's reason number one that we should be looking at this. We need the department officials to come back. We need to ask them the questions similar to the questions that I've asked today. And this committee should all want it, and they should all want to demand the answers. So that's what I have to say with respect to that. But the other issue is this. And Madam Chair, you had a question on where I was. That was the first point I wanted to make towards this motion. I have 4 points in total, and I'm going to move to my second point now, which is the fact that we need additional stakeholders to come to speak to this. So we had so many people come to talk about this and raise concerns, and one of the ones that I thought was quite powerful and that we really didn't get much information on because of, again, the limited amount of time that we had at committee to study this. And this was Mr. Joe D'Alfaro, the chair of the International Cheese Council of Canada. So he was talking about his association. The ICCC was founded in 1976. We are an association of small and medium-sized cheese importers and their suppliers. Our members are Canadian-based importers of cheese. Our associate members include cheese producers and processors from various countries that have international trade agreements with Canada. I believe it's actually Mr. Cannings that had some very interesting questions for them to try and understand what they were talking about, because it is a complex issue, and I don't think in a 5-minute intervention we're able to get to the bottom of it. The ICC has coexisted with Canada's supply-managed dairy sector for over 4 decades and accepts the rationale underlying Canada's supply management system. They're also supporters of supply management. They're not advocating for its dismantling. Rather, we continue to work with the government to ensure that its TRQ allocation and administration system respects our trade commitments in the dairy sector. Moreover, many of our members, including my company, are proud to be distributors of domestic cheeses all across Canada. I'm here today to offer the committee several compelling reasons why Bill C-282 should not be supported by parliamentarians. First, parliamentarians must consider the significant negative financial impacts this bill will have on the many Canadian small to mid-sized businesses that import cheese. The future for Canadian importers of cheese is already uncertain. This bill is only adding to the unpredictability. The unknown outcome of Global Affairs TRQ Phase 2 review, which initially started in 2019, is creating ambiguity and inhibiting business planning. Moreover, it may require importers to significantly change their business models and methods and model if the new quota policy is unfavorable to our industry. If Bill C-282 becomes law, it risks obstructing even the possibility of addressing the market access requested by the UK as part of the ongoing bilateral negotiations. If the UK is forced to settle for a portion of the WTO non-EU quota, Canadian importers will be limited to exclusively using this method to import British cheeses. And this is the important part that he goes on to say. The pool is already fully utilized. So what is effectively being said by this gentleman is that if 282 becomes law, the UK left their quota in the EU when Brexit happened. So their quota was left with the EU. They have some quota now through the transitional provisions as we're negotiating the FTA. But if 282 passes, then there can be no additional dairy access granted to the UK. And this bill is happening right in the middle of trade negotiations. So our negotiators are there, okay, trying to negotiate a deal, and hanging over their head is the fact that this bill could pass and completely upheave the negotiations, right? Because maybe there's going to be some dairy access for the UK. We know they want it. This bill passes, now there's none. Imagine if you're the trade negotiator there and you think you've got a deal, right? We're very close. Boom. 282 comes in, and all of a sudden, that part of the deal that you've made is no longer valid because you're in contravention of a piece of legislation. This is the risk. This is the risk of doing this. Now, I was a lawyer, but I am not an international trade lawyer. But we do have someone or some people that could come to this committee and give us some guidance on this. Mr. Verhoeven, I think, would be fantastic for that. Mr. Verhoeven could be asked, if you're in the middle of a negotiation and someone passed a piece of legislation that took a segment of that negotiation off the table, how would that affect your negotiation or your ability to negotiate? As a lawyer, I know I had to negotiate things all the time. And as part of the negotiating process, you're building good faith with your counterpart. You're building good faith and trust as you move forward trying to negotiate something. And so if you've come to a decision where you're saying, okay, maybe we're going to have to find a way to give the UK 0.5%, something like that. I'm just making a number up. And then we know we're going to have agreement on all these other things. Then a piece of legislation comes in and says, nope, that's off the table. How are you going to continue to work forward in good faith? It's going to absolutely affect the good faith of the negotiation. And the other thing is this, Madam Chair, is the threat of Bill 282, is it hanging over our negotiators' heads right now as they try and negotiate the FTA with the UK? Because they feel like they have to rush the FTA to get it done before this bill passes? And let's think about the consequence of that. If you're rushing to conclude an FTA because of fear of this piece of legislation, you might actually give away more than you planned to because you had to get it done quickly before you could, which is a really interesting thing as we're talking about the Canada-UK and talking about what's going on. So there was an article that's out on March the 9th from a UK newspaper where they talk about how they are they're bragging that I am hearing that the volumes on beef are low, and that in return they have also got some dairy access, which makes it a more reciprocal and balanced agreement. So that is someone involved or has knowledge of the Canada-UK FTA negotiation. So there's a possibility that this bill in of itself is causing our negotiators to rush to get a deal. And in so doing, may in fact do more harm to the supply management sector in this country than would have happened, because our negotiators are under pressure to get this done before they can. So, international cheese, this pool is already fully utilized with cheeses from the US, and that's the WTO quota, New Zealand, Switzerland, and Norway, among others. Otherwise, they will find themselves faced with three options, all of which will result in financial harm to Canadian businesses. These three unappealing options are: first, cease importing UK cheese products altogether in Canada, meaning that many Canadians' beloved British cheeses could be gone forever. Secondly, substitute some of their imports from other non-EU countries with imports from the UK, ensuring a shortage of available cheeses. Third, import UK cheese with the prohibitive 245% tariff. Imagine that, a 245% tariff. Now, this is a government that talks about how they're there for small business. They talk about it all the time, how important small business is. Here we have the Cheese Association, the International, I should get that right, the International Cheese Association. They are here, and they are saying this could have a International Cheese Council of Canada. They are saying this could have a devastating impact on small businesses because of their inability to import cheese. And so they came, they gave their evidence, they gave their significant concerns, and they were so concerned that they actually submitted a brief after they appeared. And that, Madam Chair, is not always how it goes. They often submit briefs when they, before they appear. But they were so concerned that they decided to actually put a submission in. And this is something, again, I think we should be studying and studying closely. It talks about C282 potential impacts on Canada-UK trade. If C282 passes, the many small to mid-sized businesses that import cheese from the UK will be at a distinct disadvantage. As a result of Brexit, the UK has ceased to be entitled to the market access achieved by the European Union, the EU, as part of CETA. And that's what I was saying. The UK left their market access in the EU through Brexit. An unintended consequence, I'm sure. In December of 2020, the UK and Canada agreed to a 3-year transition period, during which the UK will continue to have access to the WTO cheese TRQ EU pool, despite the UK having become a non-EU country. And so I think that's what they were trying to explain when Mr. Canning was asking questions. So they are getting some WTO access through the EU pool. But this is a transitional provision, and they go on to say that, unfortunately, the post-2023 future for Canada's importers of UK cheese has never been more uncertain. And the prospect of Bill C-282 passing would make the resolution of this problem even more challenging. The reason for this is that as it stands, after 2023, UK cheese products will need to be brought into the Canadian market through the WTO TRQ non-EU pool. So they've had some access under the WTO TRQ pool. Afterwards, they will not after 2023 because the agreement only extends until 2023. So then they go to the WTO TRQ non-EU pool. And this is where the problem is. It's a pool which already has a utilization rate above 97%. So that pool is full, right? So British cheese will not really get into Canada unless it's under those scenarios that I was talking about, which would include a 245% tariff. And that would drive, that cheese out of the marketplace. Moreover, if Bill C-282 becomes law, it will obstruct even the possibility of addressing the access requested by the UK. The UK would be forced to settle for a portion of the WTO TRQ non-EU pool, with no modification in overall quota amount, despite the addition of the UK, a significant cheese-producing member. The result is that our members, i.e. Canadian importers, will also be limited to exclusively using the WTO TRQ non-EU pool to import UK cheese products. Otherwise, they will find themselves faced with the following three unappealing options. And those are the options that they mentioned in their statement to this committee. All of them are very unappealing, all of which they say will result to financial harm to Canadian businesses. And these are small businesses, Madam Chair. They're small businesses. They're most often mom and pop shops. They're the ones that we should be trying to find a way to help them, to protect them. The government should be very concerned about this. The government should be listening to witnesses to say what this impact's going to be. Instead, this government, this committee, seems to want to just say, we've heard enough. We don't care. Sorry, you cheese importers, we just don't care because we're passing this bill, regardless of your concerns, regardless of actually even fleshing out their concerns. Because, when someone comes and has a 5-minute opening statement and gets a 5-minute Q&A, it's incredibly difficult to actually explain the severity of the problem and how serious the problem is. I've had a little bit of time today to go into some of the problems, and I'm not even getting into depth in many of these things. I'm just scratching the surface to try and raise these issues, to try and convince my colleagues that more meetings will help this committee. Help this committee make a good decision. Help this committee find a way that this bill can be a winner for everyone. That's really what we want. All of us want that. Despite what the parliamentary secretary will say about not supporting supply management, I am a strong supporter of supply management. A gentleman who owns a dairy farm came up when the dairy farmers were here on their lobby day on the Hill, thanked me for all the hard work that I do, thanked me for coming to visit his farm, to talk to him, talk to his family, and understand the challenges that they have. I understand those challenges. I support supply management. I also support the Canadian economy. I support other industries and sectors across the country. And those sectors have voiced their concerns to this bill. And when we asked the sponsor of the bill if he had taken the time to consult other industries and other sectors of the Canadian economy, he basically said he did not because he didn't think it was necessary. And I think what we're finding at committee is that maybe that consultation would have served this committee well, because we're hearing more and more from other industries in this country how concerned they were. I had an opportunity to talk about this bill with some members from the automotive sector when President Biden was here to visit, and they were unaware of the bill. And as many of us know, auto is a huge part of the Canadian economy. And when I talked to them about how this bill would mean that supply management is off the table for negotiating trade deals, they were quite concerned. They were surprised. They were surprised that they had not been consulted. They were surprised at the potential impacts to them. And this is part of the problem. This is why I'm saying we need more meetings. But I do want to get back to the concerns of the International Cheese Council of Canada, because they are small businesses. They are not able to hire expensive lobbyists to come to try and convince the government of the damage that this bill would do to them. So they're relying on us. They're relying on members of parliament to take the time to listen to their concerns, hear their concerns, and deliberate on those concerns. And again, we have not deliberated on those concerns. The meetings were fast. We crammed in a lot of witnesses on every single panel so that we weren't able to get deep, in-depth answers. We still have not had anyone who's an expert in trade come to testify, other than department officials. And I've outlined some of the concerns that I have with the evidence that they gave this time as opposed to before. But again, back to International Cheese Council of Canada. So they say, as a result of this unfortunate situation, and I agree, they're just a small player in this, but they're going to be deeply affected. Canadian businesses will be unfairly penalized. Not only will they be prevented from generating market growth, but their ability to import cheese products from the UK at an affordable price will be severely constrained. They will lose business. Ultimately, Canadian customers will also suffer, as they will either face reduced availability for British cheeses, or the UK cheeses on the grocery store shelves will be priced significantly higher. And when they say significantly higher, I do want to go back to that. They will end up with a 245.5% tariff. I was saying 245%, but it's actually 245.5%. None of these scenarios deliver an improved outcome for Canadians. Meanwhile, it should be noted that European exporters will be provided a Brexit windfall after 2023, when they will presumably be able to access higher quantities, since there will be one less European Union state drawing quota from accessible EU states, i.e. WTO TRQ EU pool and the CETA non-pool. It is worth keeping in mind that senior members of the UK government have expressed strong interest in including cheese in the future Canada-UK FTA. The passage of C-282, which would prevent addressing such issues in the Canada-UK agreement, would certainly irritate our valued trading partner and most likely constrain Canada's ability to reach a broad deal that leaves both parties satisfied. And this is exactly dovetails, with the concern that I've just raised. We are actually in the middle of negotiating a Canada-UK FTA. And we know that they want some dairy access, some cheese access. We also know that sometimes very difficult decisions have to be made, for the benefit of the country. And Canada has absolutely successfully defended supply management through very, very many FTAs. And when I was asking my questions of department officials, I did actually want to talk about this. And I asked about how everyone says that they are prepared to, we defend supply management, right? So I did ask Mr. Fowler, and I said this. I think one of the things that you said in your testimony, don't have it all, is that concessions made in supply management allowed Canada to conclude deals that are in the overall economic best interest of Canada. I know this is hard, but if we went back in time and we didn't have access, if supply management was off the table and this bill existed and we were renegotiating CUSMA, how difficult would that renegotiation have been? Mr. Fowler said, it's a difficult question to answer, and it requires me to speculate, which I don't like to do when I'm sitting in this chair. So I said, in your experience, as a lead agriculture negotiator at the conclusion of those negotiations, it is my opinion that there was no deal that did not include market access commitments for dairy. Okay, so we get back to the Canada-UK FTA. They're our third largest trading partner. And we're right now operating under transitional provisions from Canada EU. They very clearly want access with British cheese. This bill would prevent that. And we just heard that there was no deal that did not include market access commitment for dairy in CUSMA. Are we sitting here today with the knowledge and wisdom amongst us that we can still get a deal done with the UK if there's no access for British cheese? So there's two problems here. Number one, there's the problem with what we heard from the International Cheese Council of Canada and how damaging this would be to the economic interests of all those small businesses. Small businesses that we as parliamentarians should be looking out for and looking to support. The second problem, of course, is that this may prevent an FTA from actually happening. And that would be enormously challenging. Sometimes negotiators, although they all say they defend supply management, conservative governments have done that at the negotiating table. Liberal governments have done that at the negotiating table. And I suspect a hypothetical NDP government would do the same thing. However, sometimes, if you're going to get a deal, you sometimes have to make really difficult choices. And I know this as a lawyer. When I was in mediations and negotiations, settlements are tough. I used to always say to my clients, if you walk out of a mediation or a settlement discussion a little bit unhappy, you know we've probably got the right deal. Everyone should be a little unhappy in a mediation. And I think the same thing happens when you're negotiating a free trade agreement. There's things that I'm sure we're unhappy about in CUSMA. I'm sure there's things the Americans are unhappy about in CUSMA. But when you balance it all out, both sides got what they think is a deal that is in their country's best economic interests. And that is sometimes where the tough things happen. And that certainly, and I'm not trying to minimize the impact to supply managed sectors in this economy when these things happen. There's an absolute economic impact. We've heard that. We heard very passionate speeches from people in both poultry, dairy, and ag about how challenging they have found some of the access that was negotiated away as a result of an FTA. They do get compensation for that. That's absolutely true. That compensation is to compensate them for their lost market access. Whether or not that compensation is sufficient is something that parliamentarians in their infinite wisdom can ponder. But the other question you have to ask is, if we weren't able to make those concessions in a trade agreement on supply management, would we have any of these deals? Would we have a CUSMA? Would we have CPTPP? Would we have a free trade deal with the EU? I think the answer that we heard from our department officials, some of who were the negotiators, the answer to that, I think, was pretty much no. I know that there were some questions that were asked. Mr. Canning's asked, how would you? I think he was asking the canola and asking Mr. I'm going to forget his name. I apologize. How would you feel if you were always the first on the chopping block? Well, I don't think that's accurate in what happens. I think that negotiations on supply management are at the very end. They are of the absolute last resort. Our negotiators go into every single free trade agreement negotiation saying we will not grant access to our supply managed sectors. And if they do it, it's not the first thing. It is the absolute last thing, because they know how important protecting supply management is, whether that's a conservative government, whether that's a liberal government. That is the utmost important thing in those negotiations. But you have to look at the country as a whole. You have to look at the economic interest for the entire country when you're negotiating a free trade agreement. The International Cheese Council of Canada, they talk about the cheese letters. This is something that I actually don't understand, and also something that we didn't really find the time to get into. But they go on to say, as mentioned above, as part of the Canada-UK Trade Continuity Agreement, negotiations, both Canada and the UK agreed to a 3-year transition period, during which the UK continues to have access to the WTO cheese TRQ EU pool, despite having become a non-EU country. These cheese letters are only valid until the end of this year. That's 2023. Both parties have stated that they will endeavor to seek an outcome for the cheese sector by June 30th, 2023, which is barely 3 months away. This scenario, if left unchanged, will create significant business disruptions to our industry, given the planning horizons for the cheese sector. Indeed, while 2023 may have only just begun, the cheese planning has already been concluded for this year. Indeed, planning for 2024 has begun, with the assumption of at least a similar level of access after the cheese letters will have expired. As such, the ICCC urges Canada to come to an agreement with the UK before the conclusion of the 6th round of negotiations in June of 2023 to extend the validity of the cheese letters until the end of 2024. Ideally, the agreement would be aligned with the announcement of the outcome of the TRQ review, therefore reducing the number of transitions faced by the industry in the next 12 to 24 months. Note that such an outcome would not provide more access to importers, but would provide an increased amount of certainty at a time when our industry is facing significant headwinds. Increasing access to Canada's protected supply managed goods is not the only option available to Canada's trade negotiators, provided they have the ability to best advocate on behalf of Canada. Options available include the reallocation of existing quota between pools, which Canada has done in the past, or change in the allocation method of existing TRQs, such as in the CPTPP. The ICC strongly encourages members to consider the impact of this bill on our trade relationships. Our trade allies are increasingly dissatisfied with Canada's administration of dairy TRQs, so much so that the United States has launched a trade dispute, alleging that Canada is failing to respect its existing trade treaty commitments. So now you have to think. We now have these dairy challenges within US MCA or CUSMA, however we want to describe it. Will this further irritate or agitate that trading relationship with the United States? Our absolute number one trading partner, 70+% of our exports go to the United States. And the International Cheese Council of Canada...
Sorry, just a point of order, Madam Chair. Yeah, with all due respect to my colleague, I notice we're over time. I don't know the protocols here, but do we normally end on time or?
Well, we normally do, but I thought Mr. Seeback wanted to get his other 2 points over before I adjourned the meeting. And we do have to be here until 8:30 tonight, so you could just continue on, I thought, as the chair. But what's the will of the committee? Does the committee, do I want to adjourn or? Unfortunately, okay, do I have consent of the committee to adjourn?
Yeah, I'd move
Oh,
adjournment.
too bad, Mr. Seebeck. I was trying to give you till 8 o'clock. Figured you could finish it all off tonight, so, okay, move adjournment.